Alright, so we're going to open up Affinity Photo 2 for a quick start here and open up one of the raw files of a photo of some sunflowers that I took in the park with my Sony Alpha 7R mirrorless camera. It has 36 megapixel, and also I was using the 28mm lens, so it pulls in a lot of background image. It's an f2, so it can produce a lot of bokeh as well. So this photo will be a good example of bringing in some extra adjustments to make the photo look a little bit more realistic. So the first thing that Affinity Photo does after you open a raw photo is it gives you a layout in the develop persona. So here you can see lens correction is turned on. If I turn it off, that's how the photo would have been captured in the camera. And then with lens correction based on using this lens profile, which Affinity Photo recognizes automatically through the EXIF data recorded when the photo was taken, we can immediately get some adjustments without having to play around with any of the buttons. However, if we would like to change any of the auto adjusting features, we can start here on the lens profile for the persona, and starting with distortion, we can bring the image in or out. If you have a lot of straight lines in your image, this one's not really recommended, as it will start to create a pin cushion, or the reverse of that, fairly quickly. However, if it's a photo like this where there's lots of distortion already in the image, lots of bokeh in the background, you can pull in or out of the image using this feature here. We will simply leave that as is for now. Again, horizontal can square up your image as well as vertical, depending on what you're looking at. Tall buildings, for example, you might have some lines that are heading in towards the center of the screen or away from the screen. Using your vertical transition here can help remedy some of that, depending on the size of the building, especially with a wide angle lens. Again, rotation, that's pretty simple. That's a good one to use if your shot wasn't square right out of the camera. You can quickly adjust that when the image loads, and you can do that afterward as well. And then of course scale just brings the image in and out without causing too much problem on the resolution end. Okay, so moving on to the basic tab here. This is the first introduction to changing some of the settings involving the effects or involving the adjustments you can make on the image. Starting out straight out of the camera, I like to get the exposure set as well as I can in camera, so I tend not to use this slider here, although you can if you're trying to achieve a certain effect. You're more than welcome to use that one. I choose to use it at 0 on the photos that I take, and opt to use the other sliders instead to make my adjustments. So here we have a black point slider. You can see the image in behind. The bokeh shadowing is starting to dim down, as well as the hue of the rest of the image. You can see it gets more defined in the bokeh back here as the slider goes up and down. All right, and I'll leave that one. And brightness as well. This is another one that is easily changed using the slider function. However, on this day it was quite bright out, so I'm not going to adjust that. I feel like the image itself is bright enough with these yellow sunflowers. All right, so moving down the tab list, we have contrast. This one is a slider for, again, adjusting the difference between the light and dark areas of the photo. This can produce different effects. Most notably in the darker regions, it will separate individual spaces within the dark regions and take them away as contrast is increased, depending on what type of subject you're looking at. So for this, I would like a little more definition in my sunflower. So by pulling the contrast down, we get slightly more definition in the center of the sunflower. Moving down to clarity, this slider here can be a bit much depending on what you're doing. A lot of the thin lines that tend to be subtle originally can get increased in contrast. For example, if you notice the lines on the sunflower petals, starting out at 0%, they're dim and subtle, and if you increase the clarity, it starts to bolden those lines, making the flower look maybe older in this case, or more weathered. For this, I wouldn't recommend moving the clarity slider up. I would maybe bring it down, looking to soften the image. But in this case, I'll be leaving it as it was at 0. So next we have the saturation and the vibrant sliders. These ones can get you in a bit of hot water if you use them too much, especially with an image that already has a lot of color. Oversaturation will be easily noticeable because you start to get blurring in the areas that are transitory or transitionary between colors. The higher your saturation is. I tend not to use this one at all if I can avoid it. Vibrance, on the other hand, is more subtle in the way that it can increase colors, make them pop a little more naturally. I would say in this case I may bring it up, we'll say 30% on this one. You can see the difference. All colors in the image will bolden. Okay, we'll move down to white balance. Another thing I should mention is making sure your monitor is at full brightness is a good idea. That way you don't get fooled when making adjustments in the effects or adjustments section. So we'll start with white balance. On this day it was very bright out. 5600 Kelvin would be about daytime brightness, and it was blue sky above. It looks like the camera picked up an auto white balance of 5941, and I wouldn't say that's terribly inaccurate. If I bring it down to 56, you can see there is a slight change in the greens. So if we punch in 5600, our greens get a little more daylight, and it looks a little more like stem color as opposed to closer to the 6000 range where they might start to turn a little bit orange. So we'll stick that right back at 5600, as that was exactly the color temperature of the day. It was around, if I recall, around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It was very bright and sunny. Okay, so tint is again another adjustment you can make to color. In this case, where there's lots of greens and yellows, I could bring the slider down slightly, and I may in the tint, to pull the greens out of the stems. And around 15%, that is a nice color right there. A little further and it starts to change the color of the sunflower, and I don't want that. So we'll say 15% is as far as we'll want to go here. All right, next is shadows and highlights. This one can be very useful depending on what you're looking at to increase dark areas in a foreground or on the perimeter of a photo. So in this case, where there's lots of dark areas on the flower itself, we can use this slider to lighten those dark areas, similarly to when we were using the contrast. So this slider can be used to darken those areas. If you notice the brown leaving the color of the sunflower center, it's turning to more of a black or a chocolate brown. So in this case, where it's reducing what I had originally wanted to do by dropping the contrast and upping the sharpness of the seeds. In this case, if I were to lighten the shadows, you can see how, again, the definition returns to those centers. So this one you can use to play around with, including the highlights. They're the reverse of the shadows. So your lightness or your highlight in the photo will brighten or darken depending on your choice here. So in this case, looking at the image in the way it is now, it looks a little, we'll say, foggy, and that can be a result of the contrast. So if I bring the contrast slider back up, the image gets crisper again now that the shadows adjustment has been made. And I can even increase that slightly more, and that really brings a nice color to the entire photo. So we'll leave that at 50% and bring the contrast back to 0. Okay, so moving on, back up into the saturation. I may want to pull that down now, as the greens are getting a little intense now that the shadows adjustment has been made. So I can do that through bringing the saturation down, or going back to my vibrance slider, I can bring that down as well, and it will decrease the intensity of those greens. So in this case, I think around 0, it's quite shiny, quite vibrant. So I'll bring it down a little further. We'll say to -20, -30. That looks good. All right, so I've pretty well done what I wanted to do in the basic develop persona. So I will send this for processing. I like to think of it that way. And now I am in the photo persona. So now I can make some real adjustments here, using all of the tools on the side, as well as some of the adjustments over here on the adjustments tab. Most of my adjustments will come from this level here, and by using some of these features on the side. As this is a quick start, the first thing I'm going to do is talk about the grip. The grip can move your photo around, whereas if you pick the pointer, this will move your photo within the crop section. Don't really want to do that depending on what you're doing, but in this case where it's simply photo editing, I like to stick with the grip. The next similar tool would be the crop tool. So if you're looking to get a certain composition, you can use your crop tool to bring the composition closer to something that you want to frame. Simply apply, it cuts your photo down. We won't do that at the moment. I'm using Command Z on a Mac here to undo the commands quickly, just to show you what it is that I'm doing. The selection brush, this is another interesting tool. If I want to use a selection brush to either delete or create a new layer, if you watch over here, the original layer of the photo is highlighted, and now I've copy and pasted a separate layer. This one is essentially a second copy of that center, and that was using the selection brush tool. Now this is something you can adjust so that you're picking up a lot more refined pieces, like maybe individual seeds on the flower pod there. In this case, we can apply a filter. If we go to the adjustments and say we'll bring the shadows back in, now that we've already discussed them, we can pull this adjustment so that it sits underneath only this flower pod, and we can change the slider and it will change that one individual slider. If we want that to be darker, let's say there, we can bring this entire piece back over. Oh, I'm on the selection brush still. We can take this entire piece, there we go, we have to make sure our layer is highlighted, back over on top of our sunflower if we want just that one piece to change. So a very rough example. Now by using Control Z, I can remove everything that was done here, and as well Command Z, I should say, Command Z or Command Shift Z, I can bring it all back and the changes are back to where they were. So we'll keep that just as an example. Okay, moving down. We have over here on the side a flood select tool. So this is good if you want to pick out skies, areas of the sky that you'd like to change contrast, for example. You can use a tolerance. That is, the lower the tolerance, the less of an area it will select. The greater the tolerance, the more of an area it will select, so that you can either delete and change out backgrounds, or again make changes in this scenario where you add simple layer and adjustments to certain parts of your photo. Flood select tool is an awesome tool when you're getting into creating photos rather than simply making changes. Okay, and then moving on down, we have the freehand selection tool. So very similar to the selection tool for flood select, you can make any adjustments that you want. Notice that this pod did not change because I only had the entire photo background selected. If we want to take the whole thing, then we would need to have, by holding the Shift key, everything selected, and we can again remove the whole thing. All right, so we'll leave this as is and select back onto our main photo, and we'll talk a little bit about the color picker. So as you might expect, this is a color picker. You simply click on an area of the screen. Over here you get a green color, and you can use the paint bucket tool, flood fill tool, next to make a change somewhere in the photo. Again, in this we're trying to stay as realistic as possible. I won't be using that tool right now. All right, so moving on down the list, we will look for the dodge brush tool and the burn brush tool. These are very useful, especially when you're working with faces or areas that you're looking to lighten or darken. If you burn something, it tends to darken, so this is a good example. We can change our pixel width. Right now it's set at 60 pixels. That might be too much. Let's set it to 24, and we will zoom in. Now on the Mac, if you hold the Option key and the mouse that you're using is a Mac mouse or a trackpad, you can just simply zoom in like this. I have the ruler set, and you notice they're moving in and out as I zoom in and out. If you don't like to have the rulers on, you can change that by simply going into the view panel and turning off the rulers. I like to have them on, as it's a good way to measure if I'm highlighting or picking things up, or even when I'm making a crop. Sometimes you'll notice if you're not looking at the keyboard and you touch on the command button and try to zoom, your image will begin to spin, and that's something that happens often. Then you're stuck, and instead of trying to line it up perfectly again with your mouse, you want it just to go back to where it was. You can either line it this way with your mouse, or go to View, Reset Rotation, and it will bring back your image square. the undo feature doesn't work for resetting the zoom. It'll just end up making a change to the last thing that you were doing, basically. And you may not want to do that. So view, reset rotation. Okay, so we're going to zoom in here. We're going to have a look. We have a little bee off to the right here who was coming to visit while this picture was being taken. And if we zoom in on him, we can see he's a little bit blurry, but it looks like there might be some distortion ahead of him. I'm not sure what it is. But we can use the burn brush tool to darken this area. As you can see, as I tap on it, it takes away that blur. Now this is obviously too dark. We have the opacity set at 100%, so we'll back that up using Command Z, and we will reduce the opacity down to, say, 10%. So each time I hit the marker now, it'll be less dark. Or I can simply drag, and it will begin to darken. I like to use the tapping feature, as I can see a little better and notice where the changes are being made. All right, so there's a good example of darkening up some spots that might be a little reflectance, separating those petals. And then as we back out and zoom out, I can show you here using the blur tool. Again, changing the pixel layer down to, say, 12, we can blur that same area that we were just adjusting. Again, making sure to be on the photo, the full photo layer. All right, and this we back out. It sort of gives some more definition in front of the bee, and the bee pops a little more there. So in the same fashion, if we want to lighten an area, we will use the dodge brush tool. So say, for example, that was too dark. I could pull it back by using the dodge brush tool. Again, we'll use 24 pixels with an opacity level of 10%. And as I begin to tap here, you can see the foggy area begins to return. So if I went too far, I can either Control Z or I can make simple adjustments this way. Now, I like the way that it looks, so I will Command Z out, so I get that back to where it was. And we will zoom back out. And the next section here we will look at is the sharpen tool. So that is, again, a reverse of the blur tool. So we can use the sharpen tool to do the same sort of adjustments. This blurry image we can use to sharpen some areas on it. If we want some lines to be more precise, we can bring some of the lines or definition back from this bumblebee. His antennae are a little faded out there. I mean, he's pretty blurry, so there's not a whole lot we can do, but some definition can return so that he contrasts a bit better against the blurry bokeh of the sunflower. All right, we won't play around too much with that. This bee is, it is what it is, but you can see the pixel layers are starting to add a little pop of white there, and when you back out, it starts to define him a little better. All right, so moving on, we've got one of my favorite tools, which is the inpainting tool. So there's a good example here if you were changing the rotation of your image. So we'll use the crop tool to go and rotate this image, and if you notice, you pick on rotate, you can change the image. Oh, bear with me. We'll cancel that. If you choose rotate, you notice that the cursor is a rounded rotational rather than a crop, pull, grab type of tool. So if we want to straighten this up a bit to make it look like that bee is coming in for a major dive bomb on the flowers, we can adjust the rotation slightly. So maybe that looks good. And now, because we're using lots of bokeh in this image, a great feature, we'll apply that rotation. We can see that there is some areas here that are now white. Now, there's two ways to approach that. We can crop down, crop in on the image, and then we lose a lot of image pixels, and we could do this to get rid of those white areas. So I've cropped the image in, but I don't want to do that necessarily, so we'll keep those, and we will use the inpaint feature, which is a great feature to learn right out of the gate. So we'll start with our layer select. We'll pick rasterize and trim, and then we will go to filters, select, and alpha range. Select partially transparent. So now you can see these areas here that were white are the alpha range, or in other words, the negative area. And we're going to use grow shrink. We want to grow shrink the inpainted area by, we'll say, 2 pixels. So you don't need to increase this at all or very much. So we'll use 2 pixels. So it will grow the area here based on that data it has already about this image. So it's going to basically paint in that area. So we have those settings made. We're going to go back to select. Okay, we've got grow, shrink, and edit in paint. And then we wait for it to paint in the corners. And there you have it. You can either hit the escape key or deselect. So now we've got our full image back, but if you do notice down in this area here, it looks like there might be some weird flower action going on down there. So if we Command Shift Z, Command Z, we can see the areas that changed. Command Shift Z, we can see what has come back. Command Z. So for us, we know that there's a change. To the naked eye, you may not recognize that right away because it is a group full of flowers. But we can still zoom in on the corners and see if anything else is out of truth, we'll say. If the truth is that it really doesn't line up well, we may want to use the inpainting brush. So here we are, the inpainting brush tool, one of my favorite tools. We can change the width on it to say 30 pixels, 30. And then along that line, we can paint in the inconsistencies with the way the image was created, making it a little more believable, or in this case true, if we had actually been able to capture that image at the rotation which we now have it set to. So down in this corner, looks like it did a pretty good job. So we'll leave that one as is, but back over here with the flowers, it looks like it took data about the flowers and sort of just duplicated it along the edge here. So this is something that we can try and adjust. Get a little more yellow in there. Sometimes you have to change the pixel layer quite a bit, maybe say 60 pixels, and bring it in to round out that brown again. That's like looking a little more realistic on the corner. All right, so without being too particular about it, just to show you how these tools work, we'll leave it at that. That looks all right. And zoom out to check on it. All right, I think that did a pretty good job. Okay, so not too much to complain about there. And we'll zoom out on the entire image again. And as the main focus is in the front of the image, I'd say that looks pretty good, so we can move on. And patch is the other tool that we can use to completely patch out this area. So we'll draw, and then if you notice, depending on where I put the pointer, it will try to reflect something similar. So there's an example of one. We could use that. Maybe we'll use that. And then escape out. You can see the difference of the way that it was sitting. But if we select and maybe choose up here on this sunflower, maybe that's a better way to adjust. So just to show you an example of how to change it out. That's not perfect. So we'll use the way that we had used with the inpainting tool brush originally. All right. Next on this, we can get into the adjustment layers. So having everything selected, we can apply some filters. Changing the levels is a quick way to adjust. And because I have my layer above, everything below is going to be affected. So I can change the black level, for example, the lightness, right, white level. It's pretty decent where it is. Gamma will bring up the brightness in the entire pixel range. Output black level, output white level. We can move on to the white balance. We already set that in the develop persona. However, you can adjust it again if the changes you've made tend to change the overall look that you're going for or take away from the realistic look of the photo. And again, the same with the tint. You can bring the tint down again to bring some more greens out. In this case, I may slightly. Some green, there we go. We'll put that at 30%. Next, we can look at black and white. If you'd like to go into the black and white editing, that's something that you can do here as well. I won't do that with this photo, but These are just ways to change what it is that you're going for. And we will remove that completely. Next adjustment down, brightness and contrast. Here we have again lots of brightness control over the entire pixel range. We'll leave that as is for now. Well, maybe we'll drop the brightness slightly. Yeah, we'll drop it down to 10%. And into the next, vibrance. Here we have that dangerous slider, saturation and vibrance. You can get into some crazy, unrealistic looks here if you go a little wild in the saturation and vibrance. And this level, I don't think I'm going to make any changes as it is. And we will take that one right out. And next we can look at shadows and highlights. Again, we were adjusting this slider earlier, and we can perform the same task. Bring up the highlights or bring out the darkness in the shadows, dumping the shadows, so to speak. But again, we'll leave that, delete that right out. Don't need to make any change there. And then we get into the channel mixer. So obviously this is another one of those tools that can change the whole look of your photo. So I tend to stay away from this one when I'm going for realistic images. Selective color is another good one. This one if you want to make your colors pop. If you're going for maybe a little more orange in the sunflower, or stick to the white and the yellow. We can bring the yellow right out of the image. Okay, and next on the list, another good one is your color balance. So this one can really fix any mistakes that you've made up until this point by playing with the sliders. You can change through the midtones, shadows, depending on what look you're going for. But again, this photo is pretty basic in the way that it is. We'll leave that one out for now. And then down to soft proof. I like to use these. You'll see a lot of these filters on Instagram, for example, and they make adjustments for you, almost as if you're looking at a printed film version of this image. Again, each photo that I make, I'll go through these and see if any of them apply. I like the look of that. That's not bad. Japan Color 2001 coded. So maybe we'll use that. We can change the opacity here by bringing it down. So the original image is here, with the effect applied is here, maybe around half. And then if you would like to add anything else, I would maybe go to the lens filter or split toning. Split toning again gets into adding highlights and shadow saturation depending on where this slider is, so that can make a major difference on the output color that your photo looks like in the end. And then once you get something that looks something similar to what you want, if you're creating a photo, you can then balance out the highlights and shadow. So we won't go with anything here now, as I like it with just the soft proof adjustment. And the last thing I would play around with is the lens filter. So maybe it was a little more sunny or less sunny on the day that you took this photo, or that's what you're looking to show. You can change the color here. Maybe you can pick a more blue hue, which would maybe bring it to the earlier afternoon if you want. And then again, with your slider, you can bring that down as well. So maybe we'll put it right there. Looks to be a little more earlier in the afternoon when this was taken. Maybe 1 or 2 p.m. as opposed to 4 p.m. In September. All right, and that is it. If I want to export this raw image, then I'll simply go to File, Export. You can choose PNG if you want to retain as much detail as you can. It's a very big file size in this regard. It would be around 130 megabytes, so I won't do that. I'll pick JPEG as it's the compressed file of choice to retain as much detail as possible. And I will export that, calling it Sunflower. And I'll put a 1 there. Save it to my desktop, and off it goes. All right, I hope this was useful, and at this point you can close out Affinity Photo. You can save the original image directly or don't save, and from here we can move on to the next video.